still remember the moment I realized what was happening like it was tattooed into my mind forever, the instant I saw that enormous creature teetering on the very edge of a jagged cliff, claws desperately scratching against the crumbling rock as pebbles cascaded down into the abyss below, and in that split second, I knew it was up to me and only me, to decide whether to watch a living being plunge to its death or risk my own life to save something the world usually sees as a savage predator. And before I could even think twice, my feet were already running toward the edge, my heart pounding so violently it felt like it might burst out of my chest, and every instinct in my body screamed to stop, to back away, to stay safe. But something deeper, something primal inside me overrode every ounce of fear as I reached out my hand toward a creature whose breath alone could tear me apart. In that frozen moment in time, the sky above felt eerily silent, the wind whipping through my hair and cutting across my skin as I tried to grab onto tufts of fur slippery with panic. And as I leaned over further than I ever thought I could, my mind screamed about the sheer drop just inches from my boots, the certainty that if I lost my footing even for a heartbeat, we'd both vanish into the void below. And I swear I could feel the wild energy of the animal vibrating through my hands as it clawed desperately for survival, its eyes wide with raw, terrified awareness, and in those eyes I didn't see a beast, I saw something fighting with everything it had to keep living. I could almost hear the universe holding its breath as the rocks beneath us shifted, as the wind gusted so violently I thought we'd both be torn from the cliff face at any moment, as time slowed down to an agonizing crawl where the only thing that existed was me, the trembling animal, and the gaping maw of darkness yawning below us. And I remember thinking in that moment, this is it, this is how I die, tangled up in a desperate attempt to save something everyone would have told me to leave behind, and yet there was no part of me that could let go, no part of me willing to accept that a life, any life, should end like this, alone and in terror. The clash between instinct and compassion was so intense it felt like fire coursing through my veins, every second a brutal battle between the pounding of my heart telling me to run and the stubborn defiance of my soul refusing to abandon a creature that had done nothing but fight for its own survival. And as my grip slipped and caught again, every heartbeat felt like an eternity of raw, electric fear, until with one final heave, one last explosion of strength I didn't know. I pulled it back from the brink and felt its massive weight crash into my chest, knocking the air from my lungs but filling me with a surge of relief so powerful it made me dizzy. But what I couldn't have imagined, what no one could have predicted, was that the real danger wasn't over, not even close, because just as the animal staggered back to solid ground, a rustle of leaves behind me exploded into a deafening snarl, and in a blur of fur and fury, another presence lunged from the shadows, eyes blazing with something far darker than fear, and in that split second, I realized that saving one life had put mine in far more danger than I ever could have imagined. And now I can't stop thinking about that exact instant, the breathless moment when everything seemed to hang in a delicate balance between life and violent death, and I keep asking myself, why did that second creature appear right then, right there, just when it seemed everything had finally calmed down? Could what I did for the animal on the cliff have triggered something none of us were ready for? What happened next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about mercy, survival, and the untamed heart of the wilderness. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to listen to this story. It means the world to me. Before I dive into what really happened that unforgettable day, I'd like to invite you to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel Victims of Nature so you don't miss any of these true, breathtaking stories from the wild. Now, let me tell you how that incredible moment unfolded. He had always felt more at home surrounded by the whispering pines and the crisp scent of mountain air than in any city street or crowded cafe, and anyone who knew him would say that his connection to the wilderness was something almost mystical, as if the forest had called him back every time he left it. His name was Daniel, and he'd grown up in a small town on the edge of Missoula, Montana, where childhood memories weren't filled with video games or malls, but afternoons spent tracking animal footprints in the mud, learning the calls of birds, and sitting for hours under towering spruces just to watch the world move around him. His father had been a park ranger before an accident took him far too soon, and his mother, a school librarian who tried her best to raise him alone, never quite understood why her son felt most alive with dirt under his nails and pine needles in his hair. But to Daniel, the forest was the one place where he felt he belonged, where the rules made sense, where life and death weren't hidden behind polite words or sterile walls. They were raw, immediate, and undeniably real. As an adult, he turned that love into a profession, working for the state wildlife department to monitor populations of endangered species, trekking alone for days at a time with nothing but a backpack, a rifle he rarely used, and an old camera that had once belonged to his father. Over the years, Daniel's face had grown weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes had taken on a depth that came from seeing both the beauty and brutality of nature up close. He had seen calves taken by wolves in the night, rivers swallow entire herds during spring floods, and animals fight to their last breath over scraps of territory. Those things had hardened him, but they'd also taught him a profound respect for every living creature trying to carve out a place in the unforgiving wilderness. His friends back in town joked that he was half wolf himself, disappearing for weeks on end without a trace, only to re-emerge with stories no one else could quite believe. On the day everything changed, Daniel had woken up before dawn in his canvas tent pitched near the edge of a rocky gorge deep in the Bitterroot Range, the kind of place that never saw more than a handful of people in an entire season. The sun was just a pale glow in the eastern sky, filtering through layers of mist that drifted like ghosts between the trees. The silence was almost complete except for the distant rush of a mountain stream and the occasional snap of a branch as a deer or maybe a bear moved through the underbrush. His plan was simple: follow the tracks he'd found the night before, which he was sure belonged to a large grizzly that had been seen wandering closer to human settlements. If he could confirm its patterns, he could advise the locals on how to avoid unwanted encounters and maybe even set up measures to keep both people and the bear safe. The gorge itself was a place that looked like something out of an ancient myth, with sheer walls of dark stone rising on either side, covered in thick mats of moss and ferns that clung stubbornly to every crevice. The cliffs seemed to breathe mist and shadow, and down at the bottom, the river crashed over boulders polished smooth by centuries of relentless water. The trail Daniel had chosen was barely a trail at all, just a faint game path worn into the steep slope by generations of elk and deer, and every step threatened to send loose gravel skittering into the chasm. He'd been here before, but that morning something felt different, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something he couldn't name. It was the kind of feeling that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck and made him scan the tree line over and over, searching for shapes that didn't belong. As he moved carefully along the narrow ledge, his boots shifting on the damp stone, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about how quickly things could go wrong in a place like this. One slip, one bad decision, and you could vanish without a sound, your bones hidden forever beneath layers of moss and leaves. It was a reality he had come to accept long ago, one he carried with a kind of quiet fatalism that made him unafraid of solitude but deeply cautious of arrogance. He knew better than anyone that nature didn't care who you were or how many plans you'd made, it would take what it wanted when it wanted, with no second chances. That morning the only company he had was the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high above and the shifting patterns of light as the sun climbed through the clouds, turning the mist from silver to a pale, almost eerie gold. Every few minutes he paused to study fresh claw marks on trees or tufts of fur snagged on bushes, small signs that told him the bear he was tracking wasn't far ahead. He noted the depth of the tracks, the way they veered toward the gorge and then meandered back, as if the animal itself was uncertain, restless, maybe even scared. That detail bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Grizzlies weren't creatures that frightened easily, and when they did, it usually meant something else, something bigger was nearby. His radio crackled once or twice with static, but no one was trying to reach him. He liked it that way, the silence of the wilderness wrapping around him like a familiar cloak, letting him slip into the rhythms of the forest where every sound, every scent, every subtle change in the wind told a story if you were patient enough to listen. He had always believed that being alone out here stripped away the layers people wore in civilization, left only the core of who you were when no one else was watching, and in that raw place, Daniel felt like he finally understood himself. It wasn't about conquering the wild or proving he could survive, it was about learning to live alongside it, to find a place in the endless cycle of life and death without arrogance or fear. He thought back to the last time he'd been this deep in the mountains, a storm rolling over the peaks so fast he barely had time to secure his tent before sheets of rain turned the slopes into rivers of mud. He'd spent that night crouched in darkness, listening to trees snap like gunshots under the weight of the wind, feeling the ground shake with distant thunder, and realizing how small, how utterly insignificant he was compared to the forces swirling around him. That memory had stayed with him, made him humble in a way he couldn't fully explain to people who'd never felt the earth tremble beneath their feet. And yet, despite that humility, or maybe because of it, he felt a fierce loyalty to the creatures that called these forests home. He believed deeply that every animal deserved a chance to live its life in peace, free from fear of traps, bullets, or encroaching developments that carved roads through ancient woods. The sun had climbed higher now, burning away most of the mist and revealing a landscape of impossible beauty. Jagged cliffs jutting like black teeth into a sky so blue it looked painted, valleys carpeted with endless shades of green, and rivers that shone like silver ribbons winding through it all. But with the light came new dangers, shadows turned to blind spots, rocks baked slick by dew warmed to treacherous heat, and animals more active as the day unfolded. Daniel moved carefully, scanning every ridge and crevice, his senses alert not just for the bear but for anything else that might be watching him from the dense cover of trees or the maze of boulders dotting the gorge. He knew from experience that predators could be silent, patient, waiting for a single misstep. Each step deeper into the gorge felt like descending into another world, one ruled by older laws, where humans were just another vulnerable creature trying to survive. His breathing grew slower, more deliberate, syncing with the measured pace of his careful progress along the cliff's edge. The smell of damp stone mixed with the faint musk of animal scent trails, and somewhere in the distance he thought he caught the low grunt of something big moving through the brush. The sound sent a chill racing down his spine, not of fear but of electric anticipation, because he knew he was close, and whatever had unsettled the bear he was tracking might soon reveal itself. Daniel paused to take a long drink from his canteen, the water warm but comforting, and let his eyes drift over the vast, rugged beauty stretching out before him. He thought about the people back in town, the ranchers worried about livestock, the hikers who wanted the wilderness without the risk, and the tourists who snapped selfies at scenic overlooks but never ventured more than a mile from their cars. He wondered what they'd think if they stood here, alone, knowing that every rustle in the bushes might mean an encounter with something wild, something that could change, or end, their lives in an instant. Would they still think the forest was just a pretty backdrop for adventure? Or would they understand, as he did, that it was a living, breathing world with a will of its own? As he shifted his backpack and moved on, a gust of wind carried a new scent to him, sharp and musky, so strong it stopped him mid-step. He knew instantly it belonged to a bear, but what struck him more was the sense of agitation in the tracks now clearly visible in the dirt, a zigzagging, restless path that cut dangerously close to the cliff's edge. It was almost as if the animal was being chased or trying to escape something it couldn't quite shake. The realization made Daniel's heart pound, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was there another predator out here, something bigger or more desperate than a bear? Or had humans already intervened in a way he hadn't yet discovered? Whatever the answer, he felt the urgency in the air tighten around him like a vice, and deep down he knew he was stepping into something far more complicated than just tracking an animal. He could feel it in his bones. The forest was trying to tell him a story, one that wasn't finished yet, one that might change everything he thought he knew about survival, about the fragile balance between man and nature, and about the lengths both would go to when pushed to the very edge. The tension in Daniel's chest was a tight, unyielding knot as he pressed himself flat against the jagged rock face, the roar of the river far below echoing off the cliffs like the rumble of distant thunder. The wind whipped against him, carrying the mingled scents of pine, wet earth, and the acrid tang of fear that lingered in the air like an unspoken warning. His eyes darted from one shadow to the next as he scanned the slope above, every nerve on fire with the instinctive certainty that something was about to happen. And then, with a suddenness that made his pulse thunder in his ears, he caught a glimpse of brown fur sliding down the steep incline, claws tearing at the dirt and rocks in a futile attempt to stop the downward momentum. The bear appeared from the treeline as if expelled by some unseen force, its massive body hurtling toward the very edge where the world fell away into nothingness. He had no time to think, no chance to question the madness of his decision. His boots scraped across loose gravel as he lunged forward, every muscle in his body screaming with the effort of catching the animal before it disappeared into the abyss. The bear's eyes, wide with terror, met his for a split second, a raw, primal connection that spoke of shared desperation. His hands closed around thick fur slick with sweat and dirt, the weight of the creature almost enough to drag him over the precipice with it. His boots skidded, pebbles exploded into the void below, and he felt his center of gravity shift dangerously, the world tilting in a way that made his stomach lurch. With a guttural cry that tore from his throat, he heaved backward, muscles burning with a white-hot intensity, until the bear's front paws finally scrabbled for purchase on the solid ground. As the bear collapsed beside him, chest heaving with ragged breaths, Daniel barely had a moment to catch his own. The sudden silence that followed was so profound it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, the only sound the pounding of blood in his ears. He stared at the animal, expecting it to bolt or turn on him in confusion, but instead, the bear let out a low, shuddering huff and slowly rose to its feet, swaying as if unsure what had just happened. Daniel's hands trembled uncontrollably, not just from exertion but from the stark realization of how close he'd come to dying, how his decision to act on instinct had nearly cost him everything. Yet there was no time to process, no space to breathe because in the same heartbeat, the atmosphere shifted again, darker and heavier than before. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the narrow canyon, so low it seemed to rise up from the earth itself. Daniel's eyes snapped up, tracing the sound to a dense stand of trees further up the slope, where shadows coalesced into a massive shape that moved with predatory purpose. Emerging from the gloom came another bear, even larger and more powerful than the one he'd just saved, its eyes not wide with fear but narrowed with focused aggression. This was no panicked flight. This was a calculated charge, and it was heading straight for him with terrifying speed. The truth slammed into Daniel with all the force of the oncoming animal. The first bear hadn't been alone. The tracks he'd seen zigzagging near the cliff's edge hadn't belonged to one confused creature. They were signs of a chase. And now the predator had found them both. The bear Daniel had saved turned to face the newcomer with a rumbling roar, its posture shifting instantly from vulnerable to defiant. For a moment, the two animals stood motionless, shoulders squared and teeth bared, the air vibrating with the raw threat of imminent violence. Daniel stumbled back a few steps, his boots finding only inches of ledge behind him before open space yawned beyond. His mind raced for options, but there was nowhere to run, no tree to climb, and no time to aim his rifle even if he dared to use it. He realized, with bone-deep dread, that the only thing standing between him and certain death was the very creature he had just pulled from the brink. The two bears exploded toward each other with a deafening clash, the sound of their impact echoing like a gunshot through the gorge. Claws raked fur and muscle, jaws snapped with the brutal precision of animals evolved to kill. Daniel felt the rock shudder beneath him with every thunderous blow, the fight so close he could see flecks of saliva and blood flying through the air, could smell the hot, coppery tang of violence that engulfed him. He pressed himself against the cliff, heart hammering so wildly it felt like it might tear itself apart, eyes locked on the desperate battle unfolding mere feet away. Every instinct told him to look away, to close his eyes to the savage spectacle, but he couldn't, because everything hinged on the outcome. The bear he'd saved fought with a ferocity that was almost human in its determination, its strikes fueled by something more than survival, something Daniel couldn't name but felt in his bones. The larger bear slammed it backward, sending both of them skidding dangerously close to the cliff's edge, loose stones cascading down into the void. Daniel lunged forward to grab at the fur of the bear he'd saved, but a massive paw swept the air between them, forcing him to stumble back just in time to avoid being struck himself. His mind screamed for a solution, a plan, anything, but the fight was too fast, too primal, and all he could do was bear witness. Seconds stretched into an eternity as the two titans battled, the gorge echoing with their snarls and the crunch of teeth on bone. Finally, with a roar that rattled the very rocks, the bear Daniel had saved drove its opponent backward, one powerful shove at a time, until the larger bear's hind paws slipped on the gravel near the edge. Time seemed to slow as its massive body tilted, claws flailing for grip that wasn't there, and with a final guttural roar, it tumbled over the cliff, vanishing into the swirling mist below. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the ragged gasps of the surviving bear as it stood, trembling and bloodied, on the precipice. Daniel's chest heaved as he slowly approached, every muscle still locked in terror and disbelief. The bear turned its massive head toward him, eyes meeting his with an intensity that sent a shock of electricity down his spine. There was no rage in those eyes now, no wildness, only a quiet, almost pained understanding, as if the creature knew what he had done, knew he had saved its life not once but twice. The wind carried the scent of blood and fear away, leaving behind only the sharp, clean bite of pine and the faint warmth of sunlight finally breaking through the mist above. The bear lowered its head slightly, a gesture so deliberate it took Daniel's breath away. It stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he could feel the heat radiating off its massive frame. For a heartbeat that felt infinite, man and beast stood together on the knife's edge of the world, bound by a moment neither could ever have foreseen. Then, with a slow, almost regal turn, the bear limped away from the cliff, each step leaving smears of blood on the rocks as it disappeared into the forest that had nearly claimed both of their lives. Daniel watched until the last rustle of branches fell silent, the forest swallowing the creature back into its depths. He sank to his knees, the adrenaline flooding out of him in a rush that left him lightheaded and weak. His hands shook uncontrollably as he pressed them to the cold stone, trying to ground himself in the reality that he was still alive, that he had not only survived but witnessed something so raw and extraordinary it defied every expectation he'd ever held about the line between man and animal. The world around him felt impossibly quiet, as if the forest itself was processing what had just unfolded, the sunlight now dappling the ground with shifting patterns of gold and shadow. As he forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady, He couldn't shake the sense that something had changed, not just in the bear but in him too. The rules he'd thought he knew about fear, survival and connection had been rewritten in the space of a few heartbeats, and the forest felt different now, not just a place of danger or beauty, but something deeper, older and infinitely more complex. He knew the story wasn't over, that what had happened here would ripple through every part of his life, every choice he made from this moment forward. He took one last look at the edge of the cliff where life and death had danced so precariously, the wind whispering through the trees like a voice just out of reach, and began the slow, cautious descent back toward his camp, mind swirling with questions he couldn't yet answer, heart pounding with the realization that the forest had given him a gift he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. Daniel's every step felt heavier as he made his way back through the maze of dense underbrush, the forest's silence now carrying a sense of fragile peace instead of foreboding. The soft rays of the late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts that danced across the mossy ground, turning the forest into a cathedral of light and shadow. He paused frequently, not from exhaustion alone but from a need to process the enormity of what he had just experienced, the images of the brutal fight, the desperate rescue, and the unspoken understanding between man and beast playing over and over in his mind. Each breath of the clean mountain air seemed to wash away a layer of the suffocating fear he'd carried, the weight of survival slowly giving way to a profound, unexpected sense of calm that seeped into his bones like the warmth of the sun itself. He moved deliberately, savoring each small sign of life around him, the rustle of squirrels leaping from branch to branch overhead, the rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker in the distance, the gentle whisper of leaves swaying in the breeze. These familiar sounds felt comforting, like a balm to the raw edges of his nerves, and with every step, the forest that had moments before seemed like a place of inescapable danger now felt like an old friend welcoming him back. His boots found the narrow trail he'd followed that morning, but it was as if he was walking it for the first time, every root and rock sharper, every scent richer, each breath deeper than any he could remember taking. As Daniel neared his camp, the sight of the battered canvas tent nestled beneath a towering cedar brought a wave of relief so powerful his legs nearly gave out. He dropped his pack beside the tent and sank to his knees, pressing his palms into the cool earth, grounding himself in the simple, undeniable reality that he was still here, that against all odds he had walked away from the precipice with his life intact. He tilted his head back to the sky, watching a hawk ride a thermal high above, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to smile. A small, exhausted but genuine smile that spread warmth through his chest like a campfire on a freezing night. Night fell slowly, the sky fading from pale orange to dusky purple, stars beginning to prick the darkness with their cold, steady light. Daniel sat by a small fire he'd built from dry twigs and fallen branches, the flames crackling quietly as shadows danced across his face. He sipped water from his canteen, the liquid tasting sweeter than any drink he'd ever had, each swallow a reminder of how close he'd come to never tasting anything again. He felt the trembling in his hands finally still, his thoughts no longer racing but drifting peacefully like leaves on a gentle stream. The oppressive tension that had bound his chest since the morning released its grip, leaving behind a soft, expansive feeling he could only describe as gratitude, for the forest, for his own resilience, and for the strange, fierce connection he'd shared with the creature he had saved. Sleep came to him like a gift rather than a necessity, deep and dreamless, the kind of sleep that leaves no room for nightmares. When he woke at dawn, the air was crisp and cool, the forest alive with birdsong and the delicate shimmer of dew on every blade of grass. He stepped out of his tent into the soft morning light, his body sore but his mind clear, each inhale filling him with a new sense of purpose and quiet awe. The events of the day before no longer felt like an unending storm of chaos, but a story etched into his very being, a reminder of the power of instinct, courage, and an unspoken bond that defied words. As he packed up his gear, his eyes were drawn to the treeline one last time, half expecting to see a pair of dark eyes watching from the shadows. Instead, the forest stood serene and empty, its silence now carrying a quiet promise of peace. He tightened the straps of his backpack, feeling the weight settle comfortably against his shoulders, and took his first steps back toward civilization not with dread, but with a calm certainty that he had been changed in a way he could never fully explain. The fear and desperation of that narrow ledge had transformed into a fierce respect for the delicate balance between life and death, and a deep conviction that his place in the wilderness was not one of dominance, but of humble coexistence. The forest seemed to open up before him as he walked, the path clear, the air sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers warmed by the early sun. Every sound felt like a celebration, the trickle of a distant stream, the rustle of branches, the calls of unseen birds echoing through the valley. Daniel's steps were slow but steady, each footfall a quiet affirmation of survival, of lessons learned and promises made to himself about what kind of man he wanted to be. The world felt new again, raw and beautiful and infinitely worth fighting for, and as he passed beneath the towering trees, he felt a sense of belonging so complete it filled him with a peace he hadn't known he'd been searching for his entire life. In that final stretch of trail before the forest gave way to the gravel road that would lead him back to town, Daniel paused one last time. He closed his eyes and let the breeze wash over him, carrying with it the lingering scents and sounds of the place that had tested him so fiercely. When he opened them, he felt lighter, as if the forest itself had lifted a burden from his shoulders, granting him the quiet absolution of someone who had stood face to face with death and walked away not unscathed, but wiser, calmer, and more connected to the wild heart of the world than he had ever thought possible. And now, after everything he'd endured, after every heartbeat spent teetering between life and death, Daniel knew one simple truth. Sometimes saving another life means saving your own in ways you can't begin to imagine. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with fists or weapons, but with the courage to stand firm, to reach out, and to trust that something wild and unpredictable can also be something deeply, profoundly good. What about you? What would you have done if you were standing on that cliff, watching a creature that could easily kill you teetering on the edge of death? Would you have risked it all to save it? Or turned your back, telling yourself it wasn't your problem? Let me know in the comments. I really want to hear what you think about this story and the choices you believe you'd make if faced with the same impossible moment. If you felt something while listening to this story, if it made you question your own instincts or feel connected to the raw beauty of nature, I invite you to hit that like button and subscribe to Victims of Nature so you never miss another tale from the wild. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of how powerful compassion can be, even in the most dangerous places. And remember, while this story was inspired by the wild heart of nature, it is entirely a work of fiction. Please, never put yourself in harm's way to interact with dangerous animals. Leave it to trained professionals and always respect the untamed power of the wilderness.